Welcome back, everyone. So for this lecture, we're going to continue talking about the sounds of languages of the world, and we're going to look at a way that we can talk about and we can document sounds without having to rely on spelling. So we've talked about some of the problems with spelling, especially in English, and we'll look at a way that we can kind of get around that. And so we'll be looking at an alphabet called the International Phonetic Alphabet that is going to focus on ways that we can document and we can talk about individual sounds in languages of the world. So what we were talking about in the last several lectures were what the different features of consonants were. So we talked about voicing, so whether or not the vocal folds are vibrating gives us either a voiced or a voiceless sound. We have place, so where are the articulators located in the oral tract when they're meeting our passive and active articulators. So is it a bilabial sound, is it a labiodental sound, is it an alveolar sound, etc. And then we also talked about manner, or the amount of restriction that's in your vocal tract. So if it's complete restriction where you have a closure and a release, you have a stop, which could be a plosive or a nasal. If it's almost complete restriction, but not quite, you have a fricative. If there's a lot less restriction, you have an approximant. And we talked about how these are the main terms that we're going to use to describe consonant sounds in languages of the world. So in order, we have voicing, place, and manner. It doesn't really matter if you use it in that order, but that is the standard that you'll typically see. So a b sound is a voiced bilabial plosive, a s sound is a voiceless alveolar fricative, same examples as the previous lecture. So what we're going to focus on today before we get into that alphabet is thinking about how spelling really doesn't help us much in English. So we'll do a little bit of a spell check, and trying to describe sounds of language accurately can be very tricky, especially when you're relying on spelling or orthography, because it can limit your accuracy. We don't always use a one-for-one correspondence with a sound versus a way that we spell things, and you can think of lots of examples. One example that has been used frequently to talk about how our spelling doesn't really line up with our pronunciation system is a poem that was written in the 50s by an English writer called Brush Up Your English. And so I'll focus just on the bolded words that you see here. I take it you already know of tough and bow and cough and dough. Some may stumble, but not you, on hiccup, thorough, slough, and through. Beware of herd, a dreadful word that looks like beard and sounds like bird, and dead it's said like bed, not bead. For goodness sakes, don't call it deed. So if you look at those bolded words, in the first paragraph, you'll notice that all of those end in the same spelling, that O-U-G-H spelling, but there's several different pronunciations that are actually happening there. Whereas in the second paragraph, we have lots of different spellings for words that actually sound similar to each other. So this ends up creating a very big problem when we're trying to use things to describe what the sound system is, because our spelling system doesn't actually capture what our sound system looks like. And so when we're trying to think of how we actually pronounce things, another example that shows how our spelling doesn't really help us is an example that has become quite famous in some circles. So if you look at this word spelled G-H-O-T-I, and I say, how do you pronounce this word? You might have a few different ideas, goatee, gotti, goatee. There's some different ways that you might think to pronounce this, but this has been proposed as a way that you could spell the word fish in English. And it doesn't look anything like the way we would spell fish, but it comes from using the GH in the word tough, the O in the word women, the TI in the word nation, and then you get F, I, and Sh, which are the sounds that we use for the word fish. And so we have lots of different complications that are not just because of these differences that we have in our spelling, but also just the historical sound changes that we've had. So if you're told, how do you pronounce the letter C? You would need to see it in context to know for sure how it's pronounced, because we use it in a lot of different ways depending on what word it's in. And we've had a lot of other sound changes that don't reflect in our spelling. So if I ask what the last sound in the word fine is, you would say n, that N sound, or same, the M sound, trade, the D sound. And each of these has a letter E at the end that we don't pronounce, but that's part of our spelling. And historically, we did pronounce that vowel, but over time we've gotten rid of it after we had already standardized our spelling system, so it's still reflected in our spelling, even though our sounds have changed dramatically over the last several hundred years since our spelling started to become standardized. So at this point, before we really dive into the alphabet, this is where the handouts that you have for this section on Blackboard are going to be useful for you. So you should see that there's a blank English IPA sheet. This one is going to be for your study ability. It's blank on purpose so that you can sort of fill it in, take your own notes, write things that you're going to be able to use to study and help yourself. And you'll notice there's a second one for full IPA and English IPA. And we'll talk through that sheet through the rest of this lecture so that we can follow along. You can kind of learn how to interpret what this chart is saying and what these different symbols are representing. So we're looking at what is essentially just a new alphabet. So some people think of it as like almost learning a new language, but it's really just an alphabet of different sounds. And this is helpful because not only does English have a difficult spelling system that doesn't align, we also have lots of other languages of the world that have different sound systems, different spelling systems, different writing systems that you may not be familiar with. And the majority of languages of the world don't even have a spelling system, don't even have a written form. So how are you going to be able to document, how are you going to be able to talk about the sounds in those languages if you don't have a writing system, or if you're not familiar with the writing conventions of a different system? So what this phonetic alphabet does is to create a system that's able to reflect the pronunciations that you're hearing rather than the conventions of a spelling system in a particular language. So we call this the International Phonetic Alphabet. It's also known as the IPA. And the way that this works is whenever you see an IPA symbol, you'll be able to know exactly what it will sound like regardless of what language you're transcribing. So no matter what language you're talking about, the symbol represents a specific sound that has specific features. So an IPA that looks like our lowercase m will always be a voiced bilabial nasal. So our sound is a voiced bilabial nasal. It corresponds to our spelling in this particular case, but not all of the sounds are going to do that. And what this gives us is a one-for-one correspondence where we're able to transcribe and ensure that anyone that's familiar with the IPA can then know exactly what sound is being made, what sound is being represented, regardless of the language system, regardless of if it has a writing system or if it doesn't, because we have that one-for-one correspondence between a symbol and a sound. So we don't call these letters because it's not part of a spelling system. These are all different symbols that are representing specific sounds that are possible in human language. So as we look through the IPA, you'll look at first the full IPA chart on your handout, which lists every documented sound in known languages of the world. So this is something that you may look at and be possibly a little overwhelmed by. There's a lot of symbols on here. There's charts at the top, there's lists that are further down at the bottom. And this is useful when thinking about any language that's possible, any human sound that we've documented thus far in languages of the world. And so this side will be useful when we are looking at other languages besides English, but we'll primarily be using the English IPA chart on the other page. And I created this chart specifically for this class to make it a little bit easier to follow along, to make it a little bit easier to understand. This is the side that you'll be using for the most part. This is the one I want you to study, I want you to be familiar with. And at the next lecture, when we get to vowels, you'll understand a little bit more why this chart is going to be more helpful for us in this class than the full chart on the other page. So it was designed to focus specifically on the English sounds that you'll need to be familiar with in this class. And when we look at some of these symbols, you may notice that several of them look familiar to English speakers because this was something created by English and French speakers in the 1800s. So there's a lot of overlap between the symbols that we use in our English spelling and the symbols that you see in the IPA. And sometimes things like P or B are going to almost always represent the way that they're also spelled in English. So we won't spend too much time on those ones because they do have a very similar correspondence with our spelling in some cases. But some are very different and don't actually correspond to either a symbol we have in English or a spelling convention that we have in English. So things like our TH sounds are represented differently. We've talked about how there's a voiceless and a voiced version of those TH spellings. And so we have separate symbols that represent it. We have a theta to represent the voiceless sound, that th sound, and then we have what's known as an eth to represent the voiced sound. So the sound has a different symbol. And then sometimes there are symbols that don't correspond with our spelling, but look like letters we have in our alphabet. So our y sound in the word yellow in English is actually represented by the IPA symbol that looks like our lowercase j. So you need to be careful with some of these because they might look familiar, but not actually represent the sound that you think about. So for the case of that J, it refers to the sounds that we think of as y sound. But there is a separate vowel sound that is represented by that lowercase y that's a sound that we don't have in English. So you need to be very careful when you're transcribing, when you're looking at them, to remember which symbol represents which sound, because sometimes they might look familiar, but not represent sound in the same way that they are in English. So to take a look at the chart, you should be able to see the chart that looks similar to the one on the English side. And this is the one that I've designed and sort of changed a little bit for you to make it a little bit clearer. And we'll be focusing on the consonants of American English. Consonants don't change as drastically between dialects of English as they might in other languages, but these are the ones that we'll focus on that you'll see in pretty much every dialect of American English. And you'll notice that some of these sounds have boxes around them in the chart and some of them don't. So the sounds that aren't in the boxes are just other sounds that exist as consonant sounds in languages, but the ones that are in boxes are the sounds we have in English. So those are the sounds you need to be familiar with. Those are the sounds that you need to understand what their voicing, what their place, what their manner are, what sound each symbol represents. So again, some of them like P and B and T and D and K and G are often represented in spelling the same as the pronunciation. Not always, but close. And so those ones we won't spend too much time on. They do represent a similar spelling and sound correspondence in the IPA. Others are very different though. So we'll focus on the ones that are distinct from our spelling system or that maybe don't look like anything that you're used to. So if you want to follow along with the highlighting that's done on the chart, you can also follow along and take notes on your handout itself. And use that as a study tool as you're going through and as you're experiencing these sounds when we're practicing and when we're looking at different examples in the IPA. So the first one we'll start with is the one that looks like an upside down R. This is our central approximant alveolar. This one is our sound, the R sound that we have in American English. And you'll notice that this is an upside down R, and this is very, very important because the English R that we use is very different than the R that's used in most languages and even in some English dialects as well. So the sound that you're making when you have an R is this upside down symbol, and you'll need to keep that in mind because if you notice and look a little further up on the chart, you'll notice there is also an upright lowercase r sound. So that R sound is the alveolar trill. That's the trill that is used in Spanish. So the double R sound is the example that you would have there. And so that is a symbol that does exist in other languages that represents a different sound. So when you're transcribing things from English into the IPA, you want to be sure that you're using the correct upside down R to do those transcriptions and not using that right side up R, which represents a sound that we don't have in American English. The next ones we'll look at are the ones I briefly talked about, are dental or interdental fricatives, are the theta and the eth symbol. And so these are our th sounds. So the left one would be the voiceless, which sounds like th in the word like thigh. And the right one would be the eth, which sounds like the in thy. And so you have two distinct ones, whether it's voiceless or whether it's voiced. And we'll recap this in a second, but in this chart, anytime there are two sounds in the same box, the one on the left will always be the voiceless sound, and the one on the right will always be the voiced sound. So that's how you can make that distinction when you see two sounds happening in the same box. The next ones we'll look at are post-alveolar fricatives, so we'll skip over S and Z because those ones are very similar to our spelling most of the time. And this one you see, we have the sort of drawn out S. It kind of looks like an integral symbol. And this one is our sh sound. So we call this symbol esh, and a lot of times the symbols, if they don't already have a name, will be named with a vowel in front of it and then the sound that it makes. So this one is our esh sound. And this is the sound that you would have in a word like mission. The one on the right, our voiced one that we don't have as often in English, but is a sound of English, is the zh sound. So this would be our ej symbol. And it looks like you're starting to write a Z, and then you have a sort of loop underneath it, so it kind of looks like a 3. And so this one hangs a little bit lower, and that loop kind of goes below the line of where you're writing things. And so that would be our zh sound in a word like vision. So the difference between mission, the voiceless one, and vision, the voiced one, would be that difference between the esh symbol on the left and the ej symbol on the right. The next one we'll look at is up in the corner. This would be our glottal stop or glottal plosive. And this one you'll notice is on the voiceless side. It's an absence of sound. You can't have a voiced glottal stop because you're stopping all sound from happening. And this one kind of looks like a little question mark without the dot. So rather than having the dot at the bottom, you just kind of extend that bottom part of the curve, that sort of hook, and just kind of let that go down to where the dot would be. And this represents that sound in words like uh-oh or Hawaii or mitten when in certain dialects. So that lack of sound, that sort of what kind of seems like a little hiccup in sound. is that glottal stop. The next one that I'll talk about is the velar nasal sound. So this is our ng sound. We typically spell this with an ng, but it's just one single sound. So in a word like ring, ring, this symbol we call engma, and this one looks like an N that has a hook underneath the right side that kind of mimics a G hook. And you'll notice if you look at some of the other symbols that we don't have in English but that are also nasals, where that hook is placed is very important, because if you do it in a different direction or in a different part, then you end up with a different symbol. So using the symbols exactly as they appear is very, very important. So you'll notice a lot of these are lowercase symbols, and it's important to know that and to use them correctly, because in some cases there is a capitalized version of it as well. So you want to make sure that you're using the case that is listed with that symbol as well. So this one is that ng sound in a word like ring or sing. And so you would have just that one symbol for that one sound. Even though our spelling might have two letters to document it, it is just one sound that has one symbol associated with it. The next one is one that we've talked about a little bit. So we have the IPA that looks like our lowercase j, but is pronounced as that y sound. So in a word like yes or use. So a lot of words that have the letter U in them actually start with this consonant sound first. So even just the letter U itself has two sounds. It has the y, and then it has an u sound. So you're actually putting two different sounds together. But that first one is that y sound that's represented by what looks like a letter J. And this is because many other European languages, the y sound is represented by this letter, and so it won out over what English uses to represent that sound. A few others for you. We have the tap or flap or alveolar tap, so in words like ladder or butter, or in the Spanish word pero, the one that kind of sounds like a T or a D, but is just flapping your tongue up and dropping it down very quickly, almost looks like an R, but without the little stem at the top. So it kind of looks like a little candy cane, because it's just the hook part of the R without the little part at the top. And so this one is our flap or a tap symbol. And this one you will want to remember to use, even though it's not necessarily associated with a specific spelling convention. We do use this very frequently when we're pronouncing things. So if you hear someone say the word ladder, you would be transcribing that with the flap and not with a letter D, because they're not actually saying ladder, you're saying ladder and using that flap. The other ones that we'll focus on aren't on this chart itself, and it's important to keep in mind that there's some sounds that aren't going to appear on here for very specific reasons, and those sounds are our affricates and then our labiovelar approximant. So our affricates, the ch and the j sound, remember, are two different sounds that are pushed together very quickly. So a t and a sh combine to make that ch sound, so in a word like church. And then the d and the j sound are combined to make the sound j in a word like judge. And so these are combined together. You'll sometimes see a sort of hook over the top of them that links them together. In English transcription, whenever you see these sounds together, you're almost guaranteed to know it's an affricate. So if you don't see that hook, you can still usually assume that these two sounds together are forming an affricate. And they can't show up in the chart because, one, these are always language specific, so different languages will have different affricates. And two, they're two different sounds, so the individual sounds are located on the chart. But you kind of need to just remember which sounds are part of those affricates. And so on the blank one, you do actually have a spot that you can fill in the affricates, and you can sort of keep that as a separate note for yourself. The other one, our W sound, our W sound, is the voiced labiovelar approximant, and this one doesn't show up on this chart. It does show up in two places in your book chart, but it's a little confusing because there are other approximants that only have a single place that can show up on the chart. So rather than putting it onto this chart, it's actually separated out, and if you look on the full IPA chart on that other page, about halfway down the chart, you'll see a list of special symbols, and the W is listed in that set of special symbols because it has a different kind of approach to place than most of these other ones. So this is our W sound in a word like wish or water. And this one is typically voiced in most dialects. There are some people in even American English that will use a voiceless version of this, which would look like an upside down W. And so if you've ever watched Family Guy, the example that they use where they're making fun of Stewie for saying cool whip, that's actually a voiceless W. not really putting emphasis on the H. It's just using a voiceless version that sounds a little bit like there might be an H sound involved. But in most dialects, you're going to find that we just voice the W consistently, and you don't really have very many examples with the voiceless one. So that gives you an idea of some of the symbols that are less familiar. And to think about how we're going to read this chart, this is designed specifically based on how our vocal tract is organized. So you'll notice that if you look at the left side of the chart, these are the places that are furthest front in your vocal tract, and the right side of the chart are the places that are furthest back. So if you imagine facing your mouth towards the front of the chart, you can see as you go further back in the chart, you're going further back in your vocal tract. The first column that lists all the different manners is also designed in this chart to represent the general amount of closure you're going to find. So the more closed it is, if you have a full stop, things like plosives and nasals are going to be at the top of this chart because it has more restriction. And then the further down you go, you have less restriction and there's less closure. So you can kind of imagine your mouth opening wider in order to make those sounds. And then finally, as I mentioned, if there's two sounds in the same box, there's a little note at the bottom that's not always as easy to read, so I sort of put it out a little bit bigger for you. The left sound will always be voiceless, the right sound will always be voiced. And you'll notice even in the boxes that only have a single sound that they're placed on one side or the other to represent their voicing. So nasal sounds are by default always voiced, so you'll notice they're always on the right side of their box. And then the glottal stop, for instance, since it can only be voiceless, is on the left side. So the left side will always represent voiceless, and the right side will always represent voiced. So that gives you an idea of the symbols for consonants of English. The next lecture we're going to use is going to focus on the vowels, and it's very important that we've waited on vowels until we have the symbols so that we have an easier way of talking about them. But there are a few additional resources for you. These are going to be posted on Blackboard for you as well. So there is an interactive IPA chart on Wikipedia, and you can click through to get to the English vowel chart as well. And so this one, you can click on the symbol, it'll play the symbol back, and so this way you can sort of associate sound with symbol and listen to it in case you don't remember. The IPA website itself also has a chart that plays sounds. Your book chapter online resources are very useful for this chapter because it has things like flashcards, little quizzes, things that you can sort of use to test what you understand about the sounds, how they're pronounced, how they're described. So what is a voiceless velar fricative sound like, for instance? That's not a sound we have in English, but that's just an example. And then there's also a lot of really great IPA transcription and just phonetics practice in general on the Berkeley Linguistics site. So Keith Johnson is one of the leading phoneticists that is alive today, and so there's a lot of great resources through the Berkeley Linguistics website for you as well. So I'll be posting those on Blackboard, so you have access to those directly. You might also be able to just click through them on the PDF if you have that handy and you're following along with that. But as always, if you have questions, please shoot me an email, schedule office hours. Bring questions to synchronous class this week. We'll be doing a lot of practice in this next synchronous class. So bring some of the questions, make markings of any sounds that feel unfamiliar to you. Try to practice saying these sounds. I highly, highly suggest that you practice using these sounds. Annoy the people that you live with, especially if you're sitting around them all the time. Test these sounds out, practice them. Get used to seeing a sound, associating it with a particular symbol, and going back and forth to keep that and sort of link in the motor memory that's associated with that. So bring questions to class, and we will talk about vowels in the next lecture.